All right. So the objective for this chapter is chapter 3. Explain the scope of an IT audit for compliance and the use of standards and frameworks. What is a scope? What does that mean, that word scope?
Like an outlook, like seeing into the future for it or whatever, something like that, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. So typically when you do a project for somebody, they're going to give you a scope. So if you go in and you work on somebody's website or you're doing a project planning, right? You put a scope document in there to say this is what we're going to fix or this is what we're going to do. Um, so you say we're going to fix, we're going to fix your systems. Well, these are the computers we're going to fix, and these are the computers that we're not going to fix. So that's the scope. Same thing with penetration testing. The scope's going to be what servers you're going to attack. So a scope gives you some outlines where things end, right? Because we can't fix everything and we can't, pen test the whole company. The scope document is going to tell them exactly what we're focused in on. Okay? So we're talking about how wide this audit is, right? Does it um, does it audit their financial books? Does it just audit the computers? What does it audit? So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to throw in some standards and frameworks that we need to know. Um, these were kind of hard for me to absorb at the beginning because I didn't really have a good book to look at. I kind of just took a class and then I didn't have a textbook to go with it. I just had slides. So it makes a little more sense to me now than it used to. Let's see. We have challenges that exist inside the company that's going to try to stop us from being compliant. And we're going to talk about those and maybe how to overcome those. It's not always just common sense on how to get people to do stuff or businesses to do stuff. Um, it's to your benefit to be compliant, right? Or we're going to face fines and stuff. We saw that in the last two chapters. The whole last two chapters was talking about why we have to comply with these laws, and we talked about the different laws and standards for credit cards and stuff like that. The information security system domains that are audited within the IT infrastructure. So there's a lot of computer stuff that we need to audit. So what we're going to do is break it down into manageable pieces, kind of like the OSI model is for networking. Networking is if we tried to imagine all the components to networking, it would be overwhelming. So what we're going to do is break it down into manageable pieces. Okay, and there's things called domains that we're going to break it into, and each chapter is going to cover a different part of the IT systems. We're also going to talk about organizational barriers to maintaining compliance. Right? Once we've complied and we're in compliance, what kind of things trip us up and make us go out of compliance? We're going to talk about what parts of the organization have to be involved with maintaining IT compliance because it's not just your IT department. You need support from management. And then we're going to talk about some security controls. Remember, controls is one of our keywords. And the control is anything that's put into place to reduce risk. Right? It's all about risk. This whole course is about risk. We want to make risk as small as possible. What does your organization do to be in compliance? You have to pick out a framework first. Right? So we're going to start with a framework. We keep talking about COBIT. It's not COVID, it's COBIT, right? Um, it's common objectives for IT systems. So it's an overarching framework that we can use to be in compliance. Let me see if I can find a chart. SANS put out a good chart. So let's see. They put out good posters. And it's really nice because it compares all of the different systems. Oh, that's not it. I'm looking it up. Give me a second. It was a frameworks poster. Had all the different systems you could use. Um, I have it up in the classroom. Let's see if I can zoom in. It's all blurry. Oh, no, it's not. Um, Hang on 1 second. It's changed a little bit. Let me share this with you. I'm gonna have to zoom in a little bit so you can read it. But this was a poster that SANS put out, and they came up with the 20 critical cybersecurity controls. So this is a SANS product. SANS does a lot of security work. Zoom in. All right. So this is kind of like those that framework we talked about last chapter, where we have this cycle, right? So this is our critical security control according to SANS. And the first step is to inventory all of the authorized and unauthorized devices, right? And it talks about this during the chapter, the SANS top 20, right? So this is one of them. And remember, they always build on top of one another. So you always have to inventory your devices before you can inventory your software. See that step, you take this step, and the more steps you move down, the more mature your security framework is. So that's what we want to do. See, here's this technical maturity. So it tells you what we need to do, right? Inventory of the authorized devices. And then at the other side of the map, it says this is the NIST rule, the part of the NIST 853 documentation that matches up with that security control. So this is a real popular framework, as is SANS Top 20. Right? And it looks like after you do everything, you start the penetration test, because there's no sense in doing penetration test if you haven't done all of this stuff before. So we start at the level 1 and we move to level 2, level 3, and the further down we get, the more protected we are, the more mature our systems are protected, the more mature our security program. So let's move back to PowerPoint. That's what it's talking about, these frameworks. So one of the examples it has is COVID. You can have the SANS Top 20, and it talks about those in the chapter. If you want to look over there and look at the different types of frameworks we can have for governing our organization. So we start with one of these frameworks, and then we implement these controls to implement the framework. So the first step of the SANS framework was to identify authorized machines on the network. Well, what kind of controls are we going to use to do that? We might have a technical control that might scan the network and tell me which computers are on the network that aren't supposed to be there. That's an example of a control that we can use to enforce one of these frameworks. We also have to have policies in place that communicate to our IT department and our employees what types of controls we're going to use. We're always going to fall short, and that's what a gap analysis is. Gap analysis is how we fell short and how far we have to move to be in compliance. So that's what a gap analysis is. It tells us where we fell short. You're going to run into some challenges to compliance. One of them is that your standards and regulations are going to change. So I think PCI DSS is on version 2.1. When they come out with 2.2, you're going to have to update all of your stuff to be in compliance with the new standard. So that's one of the challenges, is that your standards and regulations are going to constantly change. So you have to be up on it. The other thing is policies inside of our company change. All right. When the new laws come out, you're going to have to update your policies inside of your company. So you might have to redo training. You have to might do all kinds of things. So that's some of the challenges that are external to our company. Challenges that are internal to our company is that standards going to interfere with your operations. So when you change your standards, people aren't going to get as much work done. People are going to be afraid, right? Gaining acceptance is challenging from the employees. Right? Have you run into that before, where you have people that don't want to use a new piece of software or use a new technology? Like I come around to the company, I'm like, oh, we're going to update everything to Windows 10. Everybody's been using Windows 8. What kind of pushback do you get on that? Have you seen that before?
I mean, I'm sure some people wouldn't want to change over because then they would have to learn everything else that comes with the new program or software.
Right.
It could be complicated for people.
So, where's my tools? This is what it looks like. Let me go back one slide. you're going to have a curve that looks like this. Okay? These people are cutting edge, right? These are the people that are going to be willing to change. They thrive on change. That's like the least amount of people in our company, right? It's a little group of people over here that likes change, like new technology. You put it in their hands, they'll take it. They're the people that go out and buy all the new phones when they first come out. And those are called early adopters or innovators. But you can see only, maybe 10% of all our employees are right there. And then we're going to have people on the other end of this curve that are going to be laggards. They lag behind everybody else. They hate change. They hate learning new systems, and they're going to resist you putting in a new system. Them in every company, right? And these people in the middle are the normal people, right? They're not, geeks wanting the latest stuff, and they're not Luddites that want to stay behind and don't use technology. So, what are some things that you think you can do to get people to accept change? We want these people in the middle, the bulk of our people, to accept the change. What are some things that you can do? Have any ideas? For instance, you take a trip to Africa, and you go into a village, and there's all of these women, and they're getting sick because they're using contaminated water. So you want to get the women to boil their water. How would you go about it? Typically, what you would do is identify somebody in the group that everybody respects. They're called opinion leaders. And what you're going to do is get them to buy into it. So I might find one of the women in the village that's maybe an elder, or, one of the women that all the other women care about what she thinks. And I'm going to get her to accept it. So if you can get the people that people respect, the leaders, to accept it, then the rest of them will accept it also. Other things I can do is I can put the new system in and keep the old system on standby. So what we could do is bring two computers to their desk if we're rolling out Windows 10, and put the Windows 10 machine next to the Windows 8 machine. That way, if they have problems when they start using the Windows 10 machine, they can move back to the Windows 8 machine. Or we can do a dual boot. You think that would make people feel more comfortable if they still had their old computer? It probably would. Yep.
Maybe, but then it would also be a security concern if like the old OS or whatever didn't have some of the security options that the new one would have.
We might do it, for a few months, you know, just so that
Like
people get used to the new
experiment.
system. They say they can do their work on a new system and they're not afraid of it anymore. Another thing we can do is show them where somebody has succeeded with the system. So I might upgrade a different department, and then they look at the other department and they're doing fine on Windows 10, right? So the less risk, the less fear you can you can take, the more fear you can take away from those people, the more they're going to be willing to accept the changes. So that's part of that internal struggle. When we put all of these new policies and procedures in place, there's going to be resistance to it. So we have to know how to use tools and techniques to get people to accept it faster. People are resistant to change. They don't like change. Because remember, change is risk, change is uncertainty. All right. You ever hear of a Luddite before? Luddite?
Nope.
If so, when they did this industrial revolution, they had these people that didn't want to upgrade the machines because they were afraid they were going to take away their jobs. So they would sabotage the machines, you know. And they came up with this imaginary god called Lud, an imaginary character called Lud that they said that they would worship because they didn't like technology. So somebody that resists technology and doesn't like technology just for the sake of not liking technology is called a Luddite. So you'll hear people call each other that. All right. So we need to be concerned about privacy. So we have a whole privacy management system, right? Remember, privacy is keeping information that shouldn't be out there private so that it's not put out in the public where everybody can see it. So privacy management is the rights and obligations of individuals and organizations with respect to the collection, use, disclosure, and retention of personal information. So see, these are some of the things that we need to handle, that we need to be sensitive about. There's that PII, or personally identifiable information. Hang on. All right. So these are some of the things that we need to protect: their name, their social security number, the addresses, emails, and physical characteristics, their fingerprints, things of that nature. So we need to be concerned about that. We need to be concerned about it as we have all of these laws, right? We have HIPAA. We've got the COPPA, which is the
Child
one for child, yeah,
protection.
online protection. So we can't take information from kids. Um, Remember, the banks have that um, GLB, right? Says they have these privacy practices. They can't give information up about your accounts out to people. So that's why we have to be concerned about this, right? So we're going to have a system set up inside of our company, and we might have a privacy officer. Right? We might have a whole system that we use to protect privacy. And the privacy management is going to be have some components. It talks about some of them here. We need to develop these policies, right? So we're going to take the GLBA, or whatever law and regulation that we have. We're going to write policies that say that we're going to follow those laws. That's what the policy is going to say. We're going to have somebody that takes ownership of the privacy aspect of our company. It's going to be a privacy officer. If you don't assign responsibility to a project, nobody's going to own it. No, and nobody's going to enforce it. So we need a privacy officer. After we have those policies and controls that we want to use to protect people's privacy, we're going to have to conduct training and awareness, okay, for our employees. Remember, people are always going to be the weakest link in your security because they're not going to follow these policies. We also need to have controls for data retention and data destruction. That would be like having those shred bins, so people can't go through your trash. Every once in a while, we're going to have risk assessments. We're going to see if people are using the shred bins, if people are putting confidential information in their wastebasket instead of the shred bins. We need to have risk assessments and test that every once in a while. Remember, we want to use the principle of least privilege. People should not be able to access data that is not needed to do their job. We shouldn't just give them a screen full of data that they don't need. The screen should only have the data that they need to do their job. Consider putting in technical controls, such as encryption. So that if everything else fails, if they get their hands on a hard drive of the system, it's encrypted, they can't get it out, right? And then we have to monitor these privacy laws and regulations. There's a new one they threw in there now. It's the DNC registry. What is that? They came out with it a long time ago, probably about 10 years ago. It's the do not call registry. So you can go on a federal website and add your phone number to the do not call registry, and it would be a fine for a company to call you.
It's like do not call.gov or something like that.
Right.
My phone number's on the registry, but I still get spam phone calls sometimes.
Yeah. Probably from other countries. There's no way for them to enforce it in other countries, but in the United States, if people keep calling you, you can report them and they'll fine them and stuff like that. I was always afraid to put my number on it, that if somebody got the list, they'd add me to their list. So I've never done it. I don't know how well it works.
It actually worked pretty well for me. Uh, I was getting a ton of spam messages, so I went to the website, put it in, and after I put it in, I ended up getting a significant amount less spam. So I mean, it
Mm.
works.
Was it like an SMS spam or something?
I mean, I still get some of that sometimes, but
Yeah.
it's mostly like call spam.
Yeah. Hmm. I haven't tried it. I think my grandmother put her number on it or something. I don't know. So these are the things that we need to watch out for, because what if your company starts calling people that's on that list? You could be in for some fines. So we need to monitor all of those laws and regulations. So we are going to pick a framework. We are going to write our policies, and then we're going to design and implement security controls. So we've seen this cycle before. We're going to discover and classify your information systems. This is part of that risk assessment, right? So we're going to find all of our assets. We're going to pick which controls we're going to use to reduce the risk. We're going to implement those controls. Back to what we were talking about. So we're going to discover information that might be leaking through people throwing um, confidential documents in the wastebaskets. So we're going to look at what we can do to mitigate that risk. One of the ways is we can pay a company to come take our trash out and shred it. So the security control might be Iron Mountain, right? That would come and shred our papers for us. We would go ahead and implement the policy about um, shredding our documents. Then we're going to come back around a few months later, and we're going to assess whether people are sorting their confidential information into the right bins. um, if it's not working, we're going to kind of go back and figure out how to fix the problem. If we're working in the federal system, all of this is going to be done before we authorize the system to be put in place. And then we're going to continually monitor it. So we're going to have this cycle where we're looking at the security controls. Security controls always cost you. They're going to cost you money, or they're going to cost you time. If the controls aren't working, take them out, because it's slowing down productivity or it's costing you money. Right? If people aren't putting the stuff in the shred bins, maybe we need to try something else. It's expensive to pay those people to come pick up trash and shred it. All right. So this is what we were talking about, the scope. What are we auditing in the infrastructure when we do an audit? We're going to look at the existing policies. So if you don't have policies in place, that is an audit finding. If you don't have a wireless network policy, then that's going to be a finding. You have to have policies in place for everything. We're going to verify that you have controls that enforce the policy. And then we're going to verify that the controls have been implemented and that they're working. Right. Tell me again, what's the difference between an assessment and an audit? Do you remember the difference between an assessment and an audit? In an assessment, it's internal. We are looking how to fix stuff within our systems. An audit has more responsibility. It's usually done by outside individuals, and people, they have consequences, right? They're going to point their finger at people. This person failed here and that person failed there. So when we're doing an audit, this is what we're doing. We're looking at the policies. We're looking at the controls being anything that reduces risk. And then we're checking to see if the controls are working. And those things go hand in hand, right? We can't have controls until we have policies, and then we have to be able to monitor those controls, right? So here are the 7 domains of IT infrastructure. Like I said, we're going to break our IT into parts and pieces so that we can get a handle on them. So when you come to do an audit, you're not going to audit the entire department. You're going to audit one of these domains. So over here we have the user domain. Sorry. Things that fall into the user domain would be user policies for acceptable usage, password change policies. We have controls in that domain. Inside Windows, we might have the policy enforcement mechanism, the password, that would be the control to control their passwords. We also have a workstation domain that has to do with all the equipment on the network. Okay. Then we're going to have the LAN domain. It has to do with the infrastructure devices, the servers, the hubs, the switches, everything in our network that connects our devices together. Then we're going to audit the edge of the network, the LAN to WAN domain. That would be typically be your router and your firewall. We're not going to check any firewall stuff on the workstation domain, right? Remember, we're breaking these into pieces so that we can audit one piece at a time. The WAN domain would be anything on the outside of your company. And then any dial-up or remote access users. You're going to have policies for them. That's the remote access domain. That's the WAN domain there. This is the application system domain. We need to make sure that the applications that we're running are secure. So that's the 7. We're going to go over those one at a time when we get further into the book. So we have attacks on each one of these domains when we talk about vulnerabilities and attacks against the system. an example of an attack against the system application domain would be a SQL injection attack. An attack against the remote access domain would be something like war dialing. So we have these different domains that we're going to audit. Here's a breakout of examples of all these domains. So inside that user domain, we have anyone accessing the organization's info. The policies we're going to have in place is going to be acceptable usage policy, the internet access policy, and the email policy. And some of the controls we're going to use are authentication methods. In the workstation domain, we're talking about the computer environment, the desktops, the laptops, the printers, all of those devices on the network. One of the controls for the workstation domain might be Windows updates or keeping everything patched. So keeping everything patched is going to reduce our risk of getting hacked. So that's why you can look at it as a control. Inside the LAN domain, we have all of the networking equipment, file servers, printers, the physical connection, the wiring. So some controls we have in the LAN domain would be a UPS, backups of our server. UPS protects against the threat of a power outage. There's less risk of our server going down because of a power outage if we have a UPS. In the LAN to WAN domain, we have the network that connects all of our LANs together, our network of networks. Examples of devices in that domain would be routers, firewalls, and IDSs, intrusion detection devices. So an example of a control might be NAC. So you have public IP addresses on the outside, you have private IP addresses on the inside. The WAN domain. So that's the connectivity between the LANs. So it's not an internetwork or a network that connects networks. It's you connecting to a network on the other side of the world, right, through the internet. Same types of pieces of equipment. We need to check and make sure that all of our wiring, our CSU, DSUs, the backbone circuits, we have failovers, things of that nature. The remote has to do with people working from home. So you have dial-up modems, you have VPN connections. So we have controls. A VPN would be a control that would allow us to send encrypted information over a public network so people wouldn't eavesdrop on us. Then we have the system application domain, any kind of software applications that the users have access to. That would be like web applications, like Office 365, or it could be an in-house application that somebody's using to do accounting inside of the company. So server software, scripted languages, things of that nature, more software oriented. So we have a framework, we have policies, we put controls in place. What do we have to do to maintain that compliance once we're in compliance? We have to create an assessment. Back to the question again. What's the difference between an assessment and an audit? An assessment is done internally, usually by the department in charge of that equipment. Perform an annual security compliance audit. An audit is outside, another department, somebody that doesn't have direct responsibility for those pieces of equipment. So every once in a while, we'll do an assessment, a self-assessment. Every year, we'll do a compliance audit. We'll see what controls are working, which ones aren't, and we'll fix our gaps. We talked about gaps. That's what we have to do to become compliant. In order to have the proper security controls, we need to have, in the policies, we need to have defined roles and responsibilities. We need to have configuration and change management. Do you know what change management is? Anytime we make a change, we have to get it approved and we have to have it documented. It's okay to make changes when you have a small company. When you have a huge company and you make a little change, it could take down half the company, right? I've seen it happen before at the hospital. Somebody made some changes on the load balancer and didn't really tell anybody about it. And they were down for 3 or 4 days trying to chase down what happened. IT systems don't just break. It usually has something to do with something that got changed. So we need to have a system to track the changes in the servers and the network.
To log, like logging stuff.
Well, logging stuff, but we don't want to log. Logging's more for after the fact. It's broken once they do it, right? So what we want to do is have some papers where it happened. So I was at ECU as a student, and we were taking summer classes. And about 3 o'clock in the middle of the day, all the IT systems went out. We found out somebody had pushed down an update from group policy, a change, maybe a patch coming from group policy, and it forced all the servers to reboot. So it bounced all the servers in the middle of the day. If he had to fill out paperwork to do that before he did it, somebody might have caught it. So we want to have that change management in place so that we don't have down systems. It's kind of hard having a place where, a person can make a bad decision and make a change and take down the whole company's IT infrastructure. So we want to have that change management in place. We need to have environments for testing. So maybe we have some patches we need to put in place on the computers. Some of the patches that Microsoft puts out breaks the computers. A good example would be Windows XP Service Pack 2. When you install that Service Pack 2, I know we don't use Windows XP anymore, but it was like an infamous example of this. You applied it on your machine. It installed the firewall. That's the first time we had Windows Firewall. It broke a lot of stuff inside companies. So if they hadn't tested that pack, service pack, before they put it in production, probably took down a bunch of their machines, and then the service pack was not removable. So you couldn't take it and roll it back. You had to reinstall the whole operating system. So we need these environments to test things before we actually roll them out. Talking about change management, we need segregation of duties. That has to do with not one person not being able to do anything by themselves, or like a safety system, right? So an example would be your accounting department or your payroll. I'm going to make sure that the person that authorizes the checks, the paychecks, can't print them out. So the person that puts in the amount in the computer, how much to write the check to, they can't print the checks out at their station. Another person is the person that's in charge of printing the checks. So if you wanted to steal money or, embezzle money, you would have to have collusion between two people. The more people you have involved with your criminal activity, the more likely you're going to get caught. That's an example of segregated duties. We want to make sure that one person can't bring down the system or one person can't steal money by themselves. We also have something called M of N security, where you need two people to do something, like recover an encryption key. A good example would be Facebook. Anybody ever lose access to their Facebook before somebody hack your Facebook? My wife did over my wife did over Christmas. Somebody hacked her account. So what she had to do was contact three of her friends to vouch for her to get back into her account. And what it did was it broke a code into three parts. It took the first part of the code and sent it to me because I was one of her friends in Facebook. One of a part of her code to her sister, and then a third part to a different person on her Facebook. So she needed to call three of her friends that were on her Facebook and get them to give her part of the code to get back into her account. We actually did that over Christmas. So we're breaking up something and making it so that one person can't do it. We need to make sure that we have identity and authentication. Identity is claiming who you are. Authenticating is proving who you are. Like we said before, the principle of least privilege, meaning that you can only do the things that you need to do your job. You don't have any more permissions than what you need to do your job. We need to monitor, measure, and control and report about these controls. And then we need to keep appropriate documentation of the control. So we need to use these principles when we're putting any security controls. Use this thought pattern to do it. So this framework that we're going to use is going to generate paperwork. We're going to have policies, standards, and guidelines. Okay. So policies come from within the company. They're written by the company, and they're really broad statements. An example of a policy would be passwords must be secure. The policy is not going to tell you how to make the password secure. It's just going to say passwords should be secure. We're going to have procedures that we use that spell out how to make the password secure. You need to use 7 characters. They need to be a mix of different types of characters. It needs to be changed so many days. So those would be examples of procedures. But a policy is not going to say that. A policy is going to say that passwords should be secure. We also have standards. Standards usually come from outside the company. Standards would be like PCI DSS or a law or regulation. And then we're going to have guidelines. Guidelines aren't enforced like policy and standards are. Guidelines are more best practice statements. So a guideline would help you implement something the best way that you can. You don't have to follow the guideline. You do have to follow policies and standards. So they use these different types of terms to talk about different paperwork in a company. You need to know the different types of paperwork so you know whether it's mandatory or not. Guidelines are not mandatory. So this is that configuration and change management we were talking about. You're going to control your systems throughout their life cycle. We're going to make sure that the systems are operating correctly as intended in accordance with security policies and standards. So you're going to come up with a standard configuration for the computers. You're going to take one computer on your network. This would be part of the workstation domain, right? I'm going to take one computer and I'm going to lock it down. I'm going to make it secure like it needs to be. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that as a standard throughout the entire company. Say, this is our baseline security. This is security we're going to use in all the systems in the company. If one of your computers gets out of spec, isn't within that normal baseline configuration, we need to know about it, right? We need to have that change management and configuration management. In order for to have this baseline, we have to have that configuration management. And we do that in Windows a lot. We're going to get to the labs next week that you're going to do on NetLabs. And you're going to go into group policies and set policies for a banner to come up. So when they log into the computer, that banner comes up and tells them that this is a private system, and they're going to be prosecuted if they try to, do any kind of privilege escalation or anything like that. So that's an example of this change management. We'll see that next chapter next week. Some of the barriers we have to compliance is that maybe our policies don't match our business objectives and the strategy that we're using don't jive with the law. All right. It might not be a business objective to protect credit card information. Right. So we need to change those strategies of our business. There's a general misunderstanding on the rationale for IT compliance. People think it's not important, right? You have all these business people, and you say, well, I need to buy this piece of equipment to make sure that the system is secure. They just look at it as another cost. Right? So we need to be able to communicate with those people in the organization to make them understand why we want to be compliant. Again, funding shortfalls. Maybe we have a cash flow problem, so we don't have the money that we need to implement the security controls. Sometimes the top management doesn't support you. So for instance, you put in an email policy that says you shouldn't be sending out personal emails, or maybe have an acceptable use policy saying you shouldn't be running your online store from work. And that happened at one of the colleges. They had an audit report from the state auditor, and I think she was running a pet store, and she was logging into her pet store during the day while she was at work and selling stuff over the phone. So if you don't have management support for those policies, if there's no teeth behind those policies, then we're not going to be in compliance because nobody's going to follow the policy. If nobody checks to make sure people aren't using business resources for their personal business, then they're going to do it. So the top management has to support us and say that there are some penalties for breaking these policies. If there's no penalties, nobody's going to pay attention. There's also a misconception of what the compliance will do for the organization. A lot of people don't think it's very important. So we need the whole first two chapters, we were talking about why it's important. So if we have that problem within our organization, we could take some of those things from the first two chapters and maybe talk to those business people to get them to understand why compliance is important. So we have the controls. They apply across the IT infrastructure. We have configuration management. It ensures that changes are requested, evaluated, and authorized. Remember, we don't make changes in the configuration unless they're authorized. We could break stuff. Change management provides a method for tracking unauthorized changes. We need to know about that, especially if somebody gets in there and adds an administrator or something. That would be an example. So here's the process. Somebody says, I think the password should be 10 characters instead of 7. We're going to look at that. Maybe we have a change committee or a policy committee that's going to look at it and decide whether the change request should be acted upon or not. Then you're going to have a response, right? We're going to get a response from that committee or the person that's looking at that change request. Then we're going to implement the change, and then we're going to monitor the change. If the change is not approved, then it goes back to identifying requests to change. So in summary, this chapter, we talked about the business challenges that exist in compliance, right? Why businesses are resistant to being compliant. We talked about the information security domains that are audited within IT infrastructure. Remember, there's 7 of them. We're going to continue talking about those throughout the entire text. We talked about the barriers to maintaining compliance. So once, we get these people to buy into compliance, then maintaining compliance is a whole nother problem. Who needs to be involved inside of the company to maintain the compliance? And then we talked about some controls. We talked about configuration and change management.